So let me start with this. The problem is Heidegger. What else could it be, considering that we are in Germany? After the war, Germany was facing a daunting task, both material and symbolic, clearing mountains of rubble, reopening streets, rehousing a population amid a major housing shortage. The Trümmerfrauen became the emblem of this clearing work, while state-backed finance and the Wirtschaftswunder led to a so-called housing miracle that more than doubled the housing stock by the mid-70s. In short, urban worlds were being redesigned, rebuilt, and refigured by means of budgets, bricks, standards, and plans. As this process was starting in August 1951, Heidegger delivered the talk Bauen, Wohnen, Denken in Darmstadt, a city that is intimately connected with our CRC, in a lecture series on Mensch und Raum. The line that everybody remembers is quite programmatic. It says, building is not merely a means and a way towards dwelling. To build is in itself already to dwell. This argument is closely tied to his critique of modern technology, as you might remember or not. For Heidegger, technology is not simply a tool or a device, but is a problematic mode of engaging and revealing the world, what he calls Gestell or enframing, that involves basically treating the world as a resource to be managed. That technological mindset would basically shape planning, design, as they would imagine building as a Gestell, as an enframing, from which dwelling then could follow. And then you could think of course, Le Corbusier's notion of the house as a machine for living. So Heidegger's reversal of that sort of technological approach to building and proposing the ontological priority of dwelling has been highly influential for the social sciences, and especially for what has come to be known as the practice term. We heard about already the Certé today, so the practice of everyday life, which also marks a turn away from Foucauldian post-structuralism. In it, Michel de Certeau is basically affirming also the primacy of dwelling over building, or in his words, everyday life over planning, or tactics over strategies, or space over place, and the list can go on. In anthropology, Tim Ingold has promoted what he calls a dwelling perspective, more explicitly building upon Heidegger, that has been enormously influential, also proposing a shift from seeing the built environment or environments as something that emerged, or proposing to understand environments as something that emerged in these practices of encountering a world and creating material correspondences. In STS, I have just one example, this idea of plans and situated actions that Lucy Sachman has discussed is also very influential, and it also kind of points to the, let's say, primacy of situated actions over plans, right? Here it comes. Refiguration theory, I would argue, is maybe not explicitly, but it is strongly practice theoretical in spirit. It is action-centered, it is processual, it is material and situated. We insist here that spaces and spatial figures, territory, network, place, trajectory, are made and institutionalized in and through practices, and that refiguration unfolds through these spatial practices, basically suggesting that social order and institutions are to be understood as practical achievements. They emerge from what people routinely do, and they are not held in place by societal structures, regimes, or this kind of thing. In that sense, I guess we tend to concur with Heidegger as when he says that only if we're capable of dwelling, only then can we build. That's the quote. But probably we would phrase this differently here, and we would say only as long as we practice space, that's the dwelling moment, only then can we institutionalize spatial arrangements and spatial figures, which could be like more the building moment. And I think, and indeed, I think we all share, of course, the critique that follows from this of the so-called hylomorphic understanding of making and doing, making and design, sorry, which basically assumes that form is something like an abstract image, or maybe we could say a spatial figure, and that this immaterial form, often created by a designer, would be what shapes matter. This appears, for example, in Marx's celebrated line, what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is that the architect raises his structure in imagination before it gets built. And I think it's pretty obvious how problematic it is. Tim Ingold's well-known counter to this hylomorphic model is basically suggesting that forms arise in correspondence with materials and forces. We would subscribe to this, I guess, in the SFB. It suggests that making is not the execution of a prior plan, but an unfolding, a textility in a sense. And similarly, I mean, we argue here that spatial figures or spatial arrangements emerge, stabilize, institutionalize through spatial practices and conflicts as well. So this is all fine, but, and this is the argument I want to make, by focusing on dwelling, by prioritizing tactics over strategies, by imagining spatial figures as something that emerges in and from spatial practices, we haven't yet taken seriously, conceptually, and empirically the moment of building or rebuilding, as we see here in this picture. And this requires basically theorizing design as a fundamental and central moment in the refiguration of spaces. The question is how to do so, and I think that maybe Bruno Latour can help us here a little bit. In his article, Cautious Prometheus, Latour has basically suggested that design should be primarily understood as redesign. By that he means not as an ex nihilo, out of nothing, out of creation, but as a situated and also iterative practice that works with what already exists, so to speak. So design in this sense is modest rather than heroic. It is also reversible rather than final. It is compositional in the sense that it's about reassembling humans, materials, images, standards, atmospheres. And crucially, design understood in this tradition or in this way is not the, let's say, privilege of trained designers. It involved all sorts of practices of problematizing and reassembling existing socio-material or socio-spatial arrangements, whether in policy, science, or everyday life. So accordingly, it doesn't have to, design doesn't have to take shape as a, let's say, drawing or prototype. The design can also happen textually as a way of questioning the existing and also as a process of projecting how the world might be reassembled otherwise. And I think these are the two key operations that I'm interested here, the moment of problematization and the moment of reassembly. So rather than treating design as an exceptional creative act, we can see it as something ordinary, yet as a fundamental practice for the refiguration process. And how, well, the worlds we inhabit are problematized and also remade. Now, I want to develop this point through a story from post-war reconstruction, from the process of, from the post-war reconstruction of the city of Stuttgart. I guess it's the kind of, is this? Yeah. I guess it's the kind of process that Heidegger, sitting in his Black Forest cabin and meditating on the primacy of dwelling over building, could hardly have imagined, and only a few kilometers to the west in Stuttgart, one could have seen that cities were not built ex nihilo at all, and rather this very complex process of redesign, reassembling, and refiguration through innovative yet contested permutations was taking place. So the story that I want to tell starts with an apparently, let's say, banal controversy that, or discussion that unfolded in May, June 1951. By the way, just a few months before that lecture that I was mentioning for Heidegger, in the Stuttgart city administration, as the administration basically had to decide whether and where and for which purpose to rehire Karl Schwalb, the first meteorologist ever employed by a municipal authority in Germany, right? But to tell this story well, we will talk about this rehiring process. But to tell the story well, we need to go back to 1938, just before the war, when the council decided to hire a meteorologist in the first place for a study on the city's climate and its potential relation to urban planning. And interestingly, right after he was hired, with the outbreak of the war, the city quickly gave him a different task, a new task for the meteorologist, and basically he should help prepare measures for civil defense, right? So Karl Schwalb, in the early 40s, made a study. This is not a picture from the time, it's a similar thing. So he made a study on how to use tracer gas to hide the city from the bombers. The project, of course, was a failure. Not only did the fog not cover the city well, but also once radar technologies were integrated into the aircraft's pilots didn't need to see the city to bomb it. So it was a failure, but it left an important legacy as climatologists had begun to learn how cold air actually moves through Stuttgart's basin, something very important considering that the basin in Stuttgart slows down wind and also traps heat and pollution. So right after the war, and based on this type of experiments, in 1949, Schwalb published the short but programmatic article Klimaplanung der Stadt Stuttgart in die neue Stadtzeitschrift für Gestaltung von Stadt und Land, calling for a radical and partly controversial refiguration of urban space, one that he said should be considered möglichst vor Beginn der Wiederaufbauarbeiten, as that is before reconstruction properly begins. And in this document, he is putting forward a novel and, as we will see, controversial problematization of the city. He's claiming that Stuttgart's urban climate is not just an individual nuisance, it is a major public health issue. That's the novelty, that's the claim, that needs to be addressed precisely at this historical juncture. So this is the opportunity to address this. And he says, for example, we can quote from here, he's saying, the disadvantage of the metropolitan climate is that it weakens the human immune system against environmental influences and thus makes citizens susceptible to diseases that have to be treated in hospitals every year, and that's very expensive. So that's why we need to do this now, right? And more importantly, in this article, he also traced the lines of how to solve the problem, or rather how to redesign the city so that the problem could be addressed at all. So he made very clear that urban climate is not simply given, it's not simply the result of solar radiation, of air humidity falling upon the city, but rather that it fundamentally depends on how materials, surfaces, topography, buildings, how all that works together, which means, and that's the novelty of this, that the climate of a city can be modified or rather redesigned by means of urban planning. So the core objective that he proposed was very clear. What we need to secure, he basically argues, is to secure is Frischluftzufuhr, so basically the supply of cool and clean night air descending from the slopes into the basin. And this, of course, required first, knowing where cool air forms, and second, keeping the paths open so that no building or anything or structure could act as dams for those wind flows. Moreover, he argued that redistributing green areas and aligning streets were to function as Lufteinfallstraßen, so air inflow streets, in a way already treating these green spaces as climate infrastructures. So what happened in 1951? Schwalb had worked for the city administration until 1949. He was probably unemployed, I don't know this. But in 1951, the Chemical Research Office, the Chemisches Untersuchungsamt, made a new Bergvertrag with Schwalb to take over a series of studies, especially considering that the unit's director was about to retire. And with that, and this is an interesting thing, a controversy unfolded about what Schwalb was really supposed to do, where exactly he should be hired, who should be his superior, and so on and so forth. And this started because the Gesundheitsamt, so the health office, had serious concerns about how Schwalb had been acting as the spokesperson of the relationship between urban climate and public health. So in many of menus that we have gone through with Indra Van Pravahariaka, who is over there, officials from this office were pushing back on several of Schwalb's Entgleisungen, so going too far. For example, his assertion that basin residents are sicker than those on the heights, which was not proven at all, or his claim that streets covered with tar made cancer rise to the top cause of death, which was, of course, to be rejected on several grounds to begin with. It was cardiovascular diseases that ranked first, and cancer only second. And more importantly, they explained that the rise of cancer-related mortality has to do with aging and it has to do with better diagnosis and was certainly not an effect of asphalt on the streets, right? But beyond these claims, the issue was who gets to problematize the relationship between urban climate and public health. So the Gesundheitsamt was, on the one hand, fully in favor of rehiring Schwalb, but on one condition, namely that alle Fragen der Hygiene, so all questions related to hygienics, remain in their domain. The city should employ him at the Chemisches Untersuchungsamt to install sensors, to build a measurement network, to collect data about environmental factors such as dust, noise, gases, temperature, but he should, and the unit should send the data to the health office, which alone could speak about the impact of climate on public health. They also argued that Schwalb's work needs to be labeled klimatologisch and not klimahygienisch, and insisted that klimatologie needs to be understood as a Hilfswissenschaft, that is an auxiliary science. So a boundary was clearly drawn. Climatology, degraded to an auxiliary science, would provide the data, and medicine would speak about the relationship between city, our climate, and health. So this controversy continued for several years. I won't talk about this, but you can have a look. We had several documents like this dealing with the question, this is the next year, and still is like, what is this guy doing? So dealing with the question of how to define what Dr. Schwalb should do. And we see how the Gesundheitsamt insists again and again that climatology should be relegated to its place. But the thing is that climatology was becoming anyway a more and more important knowledge form for the redesign of cities. And even though Schwalb was not allowed to have the last word on klimahygienischen questions, by the time this controversy was unfolding in the early 50s, his problematization had already been accepted and promoted by the most important actor in the process of redesigning Stuttgart, namely Walter Höss and the Zentrale für den Wiederaufbau, the ZAS. So interestingly, Schwalb had published his 1949 article on Klimaplanung, actually, as you can see here, as a complementary material to the main article, the Aufbauplan der Stadt Stuttgart, written precisely by the Generalbaudirektor Walter Höss. In that article, Höss takes up Schwalb's program 100% and translates all his ideas into a spatial program. He describes Stuttgart as climatically disadvantaged and states that only a decisive climate planning effort will remedy this. He proposed precisely the open space structures of this Grünwände descending into the basin. He assigns the Stadtpark a very important climate role, not just an amenity function. He defines, for example, the Nessenbachtal as a principal supply route for cool air and proposes a bunch of forestry and topography measures to make sure that the night air will fit into the inner city. He also insists that depressions and descent lines need to remain free in construction, establishing a sort of do not obstruct the wind rule for these open spaces. In short, Höss takes up all of Schwalb's principles and turn them into a rebuilding plan. So it's not surprising that in 1951, that the request of 1951 to rehire the meteorologists was also kind of supported explicitly and very strongly by the Center for the Wiederaufbau of Stuttgart. In one letter that we found, the ZAS is explaining that they had hired Schwalb in the past and they were very happy with the results of a study and they let him go, but then only later they realized that when it comes to climate issues cannot be dealt with like one study and one report or one set of general principles, but we need to have an ongoing relationship. So that's why we need to hire him. And in this Werkvertrag of 1951, was the new beginning for this very close relationship between climatology and planning. And it says in the document we saw before that he should carry out studies on climate planning for the ZAS, initially also for the planning area of the Western Basin part of the city. So they needed maps that would show precisely where the air must flow so that planning could act accordingly. So from then on, the climatology and the ZAS began to work hand in hand, as I said. The ZAS was constantly requesting district-level Gutachten, traffic air analysis, checks near industrial sites, and the climate office was doing measuring, giving feedback, and the planners were folding these constraints into the lines of the plans that they were drawing. So these reports were leading to drawings, which required further reports, and a whole cycle started through which Schwalb's Frischluftzufuhr was translated into planning measures. And so what happened in the next decades was a consequence of this precise moment. So what happened? Firstly, the new climatological refiguration of urban spaces became publicly celebrated in urbanism and also in planning events such as the Bundesgartenschau in 1961, when a 5-kilometer pedestrian route was a demonstration that Stuttgart is implementing these ideas, or here in the 1976 film submitted by Germany to the first Habitat Conference in Vancouver, where Stuttgart gained global notoriety as the city that has pioneered climate planning worldwide. Also in the creation of this type of policy devices that start to circulate also in different directions. And Schwalb became also a public figure. So in Stuttgart, right? And also a leading figure in the field here, flying to the US to help American cities to confront the urban heat island. And we see him, Karl Schwalb, in action. I love this subtitle. So that's one thing that happened, right? What also happened, and this is something that Indravan Prabhakariaka and I have worked out in a recent article that was published in the SFB, is that a number of conflicts along the Frischluftschneisen began to arise in the 1990s. Firstly, as citizen initiatives mobilized, kind of use this urban climatological knowledge in order to protest against real estate developments that would affect Stuttgart's green ribbons. And secondly, also in the other direction, as homeowners began to sue the city of Stuttgart because of the prohibition that the city was putting on them to expand their houses that were located along the Frischluftschneisen. So these are some of the things that happened later on. The key is that moment, right, that I was trying to present. So I would like to conclude with a reflection about the place that design or understood, or as redesign, right, understood as this double movement of problematization and reassembly should or could occupy in the theoretical architecture of refiguration theory. In a nutshell, my argument is that design, understood as redesign, must take a prominent role alongside the current focus on conflict in order to account for the processual character of refiguration. Allow me to explain this briefly. Refiguration theory, as developed so far, or as I understand this so far, explains socio-spatial change primarily in terms of conflicts. Refiguration is cast as a conflictual process where what is at stake are different spatial logics or spatial figures, and in the contradictions and tensions between these logics, spaces, concrete spaces, are rearranged, reimagined, refigured in a constant process. And of course, conflicts are never fully resolved. They underlie this process of refiguration, making possible that this goes on and on, so to speak, because every new spatial arrangement doesn't just respond to a spatial conflict, it also articulates new conflicts. So this centrality of conflict as the motor of history or the motor of refiguration evokes Marx, I think, with the main important difference that what is at stake here are not conflicts among social classes or social groups, but among spatial logics or spatial figures, practices, and so on. So conflicts underlie transformation, even if they are not consciously perceived or named as such. This is how I understand we often argue. Thinking about the process of refiguration through the case of Stuttgart might lead to a slightly different take on how this unfolds. So instead of a conflict between different spatial logics that are intrinsic to a situation, redesign operates by producing a new framing of the situation. So problematization is not simply something that is inherent to a situation, kind of a conflict waiting to be uncovered, but is something that is actively done. Problematization is basically the invention of problems, the addition of a new component, a new dimension, or a new perspective on a situation which radically changes the way in which we assess that situation. So to think this, we can indeed come back to Marx, but not to the Marx sociologists concerned with social structures and social conflicts, but maybe to the political economists interested in these moments of economic crisis, critical conjunctures that shape the transformation of capitalism. And even as Boltanski and Chapello have shown, this transformation of capitalism is shaped by moments in which new forms of critique problematize, in this case, capitalism, and lead to what we could call a refiguration. So to put it differently, taking redesign as the motor of the refiguration process involves not looking for this sort of structural or logical underlying conflicts that are present everywhere and all the time, but it's rather about looking for specific moments when a social actor or a set of social actors engage critically with the present, problematizes things in a new way, and opens up new perspectives for the reassembly of knowledges, institutions, materials, and ultimately spaces. Refiguration thus becomes not only conflictual, but projective, compositional, and also timed. And this is also the last point I would like to make. The critical moments of redesign are not simultaneous. And I think we have never fully justified, in the context of the ERC, why we often say that refiguration process, or that we are looking at refiguration from the 60s on. I mean, we in the CRC, we often point to the 60s as a key moment where the current refiguration process sort of starts. This is not really, I would say, the case of this refiguration, this climatological refiguration of cities. Here, the key moment is not the 60s, it's actually the late 40s or early 50s, so the post-war moment that matters. So this is the moment in when this climatological refiguration of urban spaces emerge. And of course, the materialization of that is a long process, is full of conflicts, and is also differently timed in different places. We have followed, for example, how this refiguration of urban space travels to Japan in the 80s, 90s, and how it fails to become real. But so it might vary. So, but the point I want to make, and now I really finish, is that by moving from more general or abstract conflicts between spatial logics to concrete moments of spatial redesign, we can be, let's say, liberated from the need to identify one moment in time, like the 60s, when the refiguration process started for a world society as a whole, which is ultimately kind of the claim, I guess. And we can multiply the times and histories of refiguration processes in the plural. That's it. Thank you. Many thanks.